I call Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the Taxation, International Investment in Remedial Matters Bill. Now, if you've been listening to the debate, you may be somewhat confused about which bill we're talking about. The reason you might be confused is because the Minister, on introducing the bill, read the wrong speech. The Minister, the Honourable Jonathan Coleman, for 10 minutes gave us a speech about the bill which we are not currently considering before the House, a bill that has actually gone to Select Committee and gone through the whole process. So here we sit tonight discussing the government's technical competence to run taxation policy, having the bill introduced with a 10-minute speech from the Minister, not about the bill that's before us, but about another bill. Now, I would ask you, can we be confident in that the government, the National Party, knows what it's doing about taxation policy when the Minister introducing the bill doesn't even check, when he looks at the top of his speech, he doesn't check that the speech name at the top of his speech matches the name of the bill that he is supposedly introducing into the House. So he then reads a 10-minute speech about a bill which he is not introducing into the House. So what we are actually considering tonight, even though the National Party are completely unaware of it, even though it's their bill, we are actually discussing a bill called the Taxation, International Investment in Remedial Matters Bill. And if you want to look at more detail for the bill, I suggest you go online, because you won't get any of the information from the Minister's speech, because the Minister gave a speech about a different bill, not the one that we have in front of us tonight. Anyway, so considering the bill we have in front of us tonight, the Green Party will support this bill to Select Committee, but we have a lot of reservations about this bill, and so we're going to seek to redress and to see whether we can improve the bill. The bill does a lot of things. It's actually a pretty complex bill. I mean, I could have understood if the Minister had been confused about the bill. It's a complex bill, no question about it. It wasn't that the Minister was confused about this bill. He thought that he was introducing a different bill. It's not that he was a bit confused about the detail of this bill, because it is a complicated bill, I give you that. He actually thought he was introducing an entirely different bill, not this bill. So Jonathan Coleman stood up there and gave a 10-minute speech about a different bill, not the one we're looking at tonight. But the one we're looking at tonight is a complicated bill, but the long and short of this bill, what it does is that it is a trade-off. Basically, what it says is that we will effectively cut some of the corporate taxes in order to try to encourage New Zealand businesses to stay here rather than relocating overseas. That's the long and the short of it. There's a lot more to it. It's a long bill, but what it basically says is there's a bit of a trade-off, and that what we're going to accept is some lower company tax revenue in New Zealand, in the orders of tens of millions of dollars, and this will be done on the basis that by doing this we're more likely to keep these New Zealand businesses in New Zealand rather than locating themselves overseas. Now, the Green Party accepts that we live in a globalised world with a globalised economy, so we have to be competitive, and that means looking at the tax system. However, the measures that promote tax equity with other countries and encourage New Zealand-based companies to stay here, they bring jobs and they keep expertise here, but there's a trade-off, because there's a trade-off in terms of loss of tax revenue. So for us, the problem is this a clever response to the challenge of globalisation? I think is the real question. It seems to us that this bill is a pretty blunt response. It's largely ideological, in fact, because there is very little evidence that actually these tax changes will stop companies from moving offshore. The regulatory impact statement of this bill, Mr Coleman, not another one, the regulatory impact statement prepared by Treasury and the IRD are very thin on actual hard evidence of the threat of moving overseas. In fact, the IRD says in one of their regulatory impact statements on this bill, and I quote, "A key gap in the analysis is that it is not possible to quantify the economic benefits of fairer tax treatment. Quantification would require knowledge about the sensitivity of business location choices to tax, which is not directly observable." That is, that we're not exactly sure what would happen if we didn't introduce these tax changes. Would any New Zealand businesses actually relocate overseas? We don't know. And what the IRD are saying, and Treasury are also saying, is that there's actually very little hard evidence to know. The other thing about this bill is it does nothing to promote better business outcomes through tax treatment that backs winners. This legislation will do nothing to drive the New Zealand economy to deliver more sustainable outcomes. So while there's a hope, and it really is only a hope because there's no hard evidence that this bill will help keep businesses in New Zealand, it doesn't actually drive us towards what the Greens think we should be embracing, which is the green economic wave. The next economic wave is the green economic wave, and if New Zealand wants to prosper, we must write our laws in a way that prioritises the development of sustainable industries like renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, green technology, high technology, green design, energy efficiency. Those are the kind of tax measures that you could introduce if you wanted to be competitive in a globalised world in order to make sure that the kind of businesses that are going to prosper in the future base themselves in New Zealand, we could have tax law that targets tax breaks to those kind of businesses. Now, what this bill does is it just has a generic tax break in the hope that by giving away a few tens of millions of dollars, we will keep these New Zealand businesses here. It would be much better, in our view, if we were to actually target those tax breaks towards the kinds of industries that we want to encourage and actually have prosper in New Zealand. So this bill, what it does is adds about another $30 million to the government's $1.5 billion corporate tax cut package. Now, none of the package that the government's promoted picks winners, and none of it promotes more sustainable economic outcomes. We think there's a strong argument for actually supporting and targeting tax breaks towards the industries of the future, which are going to be the clean tech and green tech industries. And obviously the Green Party's approach is to reform the tax system to encourage those kind of industries. So while complex in the detail, a majority of the tax measures in this bill involve a similar trade-off. It's a lower company tax revenue versus the risk of company emigration offshore. This creates a problematic tension between racing to the bottom with company tax breaks in a race that we simply cannot win in the long term, or the losing of tax revenues and jobs as companies move offshore motivated by tax reasons. Now, the Labor law that we saw recently in this House, passed through under urgency to secure the filming of The Hobbit, was a disturbing example of this kind of bidding war in a race to the bottom. And so the danger with this kind of tax legislation is that sovereign nations all around the planet compete with each other to have lower and lower corporate taxation in order to try to keep businesses or to get businesses to locate to our country. And this race to the bottom, we don't think is a very clever strategy. Is not a very clever strategy in terms of trying to actually support New Zealand businesses, in terms of trying to encourage sustainable New Zealand businesses that embrace the green wave here. Now, each tax measure in this bill is slightly different. There's a whole bunch of them, and we may support some measures while not supporting others. However, in principle, we should not support the slow erosion. As a parliament, we should not be supporting the slow erosion of our tax base for these kind of unquantifiable theoretical gains, because, as the regulatory impact statement says on the bill, it's very hard to quantify it. New Zealand would do much better to understand our natural advantages and to play to them, while simultaneously extending our efforts abroad in international forums to agree to satisfactory environmental, labour and tax standards. We would do much better to work with other countries to agree on some minimum standards, whether it be around tax, labour, environmental standards, so that we don't compete with each other on environmental standards, on labour standards or on tax rates. This is a relatively small sum in this bill, maybe $30 million per year, so it's even small compared to the nearly $100 million which was given away to encourage The Hobbit to be based here, but it's still part of this overall trend of this race to the bottom. So for these reasons, the Green Party will be supporting the bill to Select Committee because we understand the basic intent of the bill, because there's a lot of components of the bill that we do support, but we do raise a flag and we're not guaranteeing our support further because of the whole problem of race to the bottom that is encapsulated in this bill.